Chris Fitzgerald, and thanks for joining me for the Base Technique series. In the first Base Jitsu video, we examined a method of core-centric technique for the double base that focuses on keeping the hands, fingers, and forearm relaxed while drawing power and leverage from the core of the body. Due to time constraints and the nature of a video presentation, most of the emphasis was on the parts of the chain that are most visible, namely the hands and to a lesser extent the elbow and shoulders. This is useful, and when I was a younger player constituted progress in a positive direction toward core centricity. But like many concepts, the idea of core centricity is subtle and layered, and it's difficult to see the whole picture until the links in the chain connecting the surface to the center are connected one by one. As a side note, if you haven't already watched the first video, I would recommend doing so before watching this one, as everything we address here is made to build on the concepts introduced in that last presentation. In this installment, I'd like to focus on the concepts of the true center of the mechanism that were touched on briefly at the very end of the previous video in the arpeggio exercise shot from 3 angles. The 2 additional angles shot in addition to the customary front angle were called the tilt axis and the rotation axis. And I'd like to pick up here discussing these topics where the other video left off. Spoiler alert, what this video is really about. Before we get too deep in the weeds, and we are going to get pretty deep in the weeds with details here, it's important to state up front that what we are calling the tilt axis and the rotation axis are really just fancy names for moving your entire torso from the hip like this for tilt, and like this for rotation. And in truth, almost every bassist I've ever met already uses both of these axes in some ways every time they play. But often, especially with students, I see these mechanisms used in subconscious and unintentional ways, almost as an afterthought, that doesn't seem to take into account their fundamental nature and power. The goal of this presentation is to encourage all players to view these central core movements as the ultimate source of the greatest physical strength that all human beings possess, and to learn to draw on this strength with purpose and intent. Properly used, these basic central motions can improve and fortify any technique, no matter how developed or advanced. And now back to your regularly scheduled presentation. Before we begin, let's stipulate that the whole point of examining these axes in the first place is to focus on how they contribute to keeping the wrists at a healthy playing angle, which traditional pedagogy basically defines as relatively straight and unflexed, and which places the left hand fingers in an optimal position to stop the strings without undue strain on the tendons. For our purposes here, any wrist position that is unduly flexed in any direction will be considered suboptimal for preventing injury and promoting relaxed technique. Coincidentally, in Aikido, a number of the most common and effective joint lock techniques involve overflexion of the wrist, which causes the recipient of the lock to move quickly to alleviate the pressure. I'll do a little demonstration of that. So one of the joint locks involved flexing the wrist like this, which causes the other person to move away from the pressure. Another one like this, and a third one like this. When done correctly, they're very effective. And we don't want any of that kind of flexion in our bass playing. So for our purposes here, a relaxed wrist can be defined as reasonably in line with the forearm, in other words, not laterally extended this way or this way, and one in which the break angle of the wrist is small enough that it does not cause the tendons connecting the fingers to the forearm to automatically straighten the fingers from their natural relaxed position. Try this demonstration with me. Drop your left hand to your side. Let it relax. Let the fingers fall into whatever position they naturally want to be in. Now bring that hand up and hold it in front of you. Notice the fingers are kind of naturally curved. The thumb's just sort of hanging out. And now when we move this wrist forward and back, there's a little bit of play in here, which doesn't cause the fingers to change their position at all. That's because there's enough play in the tendons on either side, the flexors on this side and the extensors on this side, that they're not being strained within this range of the wrist motion. However, if you go beyond this range, wherever yours happens to be, I'm going to move my hand down at this point with the other hand. If you force that hand open, notice that those fingers naturally will extend. So here they're relaxed. if you move the wrist to too far of a position, those fingers will naturally extend. That's because all of the slack has been taken up in the extensor tendons at this point. So we want to keep everything pretty much in this range where this isn't happening yet. So, having stated that everything in this video is designed to get the smaller links in the chain into a healthy position and better support them, we can move on to the two central core axes. Let's start with the tilt axis. It's inextricably tied in with the concept of extension of the arms and how to use that extension to allow the arms to be both relaxed and also very strong at the same time by connecting them to the core. I'd like to start this segment with a discussion of two related concepts that need to be considered separately before they can be combined and understood as a whole. These concepts can be reduced to the general ideas of wingspan and elbow angle. In its most basic sense, wingspan is simply the distance from the right middle fingertip to the left middle fingertip when both arms are spread as wide and straight as they can go. Human bodies are different and it's difficult to generalize, but research shows that most people have a wingspan that is roughly equivalent to their height, with the wingspan tending to err on the side of slightly greater than their height. As an example, I'm slightly over 6'1", and my wingspan is 74.5 inches, which fits this formula. The smallest statured student I've ever taught was 4'11" with a 60-inch wingspan, which also fits the general rule. Wingspan matters for basis because our instrument requires that our arms wrap around a large wooden object with the right hand extended downward toward our feet, while our left hand is often called on to reach upward to the level of our ears and maybe even beyond. Those of us who teach need to understand that the geometry of the base is different to people of different stature, and that what works for a person with a large wingspan might not work for a person with a shorter wingspan, and vice versa. In extreme cases, a person with an extremely short wingspan may be better off playing a bass with a shorter scale length and smaller shoulders to allow for better reach. For example, the student with the 60-inch wingspan I mentioned earlier chose to play a 5/8 size bass, and she was an absolute beast on that instrument. The 2.5 inches that she gained in scale length and the unknown amount that she gained by virtue of the smaller rib depth and shoulder width put her on a more equal footing with her fellow students, allowing her to play without limitations. But for most of us, inhabiting a more average range of stature, a smaller bass than the standard 3/4 size with a 41.5-inch scale length isn't necessary if we learn to navigate the geometry of playing carefully. Let's move on from wingspan to elbow angle to see how these two characteristics interact. In the ISB video, we mainly focused on the idea of arm extension in the right arm as a way to keep the plucking or bow arm relaxed and connected to the core, but the same mechanics exist for the left arm as well, and the core connection is equally important on this side of the body. It's important because the goal for the relaxed left hand is to press down the string from the core rather than from the fingers or by using the left thumb to squeeze. Squeezing with the fingers and thumb tends to disengage the hand from the core rather than engaging it. But before I go to great lengths to try and describe the importance of a healthy elbow angle in words, try this simple exercise with me. To begin, extend your left arm using the unbendable arm concept we introduced in the first video. Feel the core engagement in your chest, shoulder, and back. Now turn the palm towards your face while keeping that same sense of engagement. Next, place your right palm in your left palm. Keep your left palm relaxed and don't make a fist, and push gently away from your body with your right arm. You should feel your core muscles on your left side engage further to keep the arm where it is. Now, gradually close the angle of your left elbow and feel what happens to the core connection as that angle gradually gets smaller. What you should feel past a certain point is that the sense of core connection diminishes, especially in the chest, once that angle gets past a certain point. Beyond that point, the core is more and more disengaged, and the players tend to rely more and more on the fingers and thumb and forearm again to try to stop the string. It's impossible to put a scientific number on the angle because all bodies are different. But for my body, that point of no return angle is somewhere between 90 and 45 degrees. So for my purposes, I try to keep my left arm angle at greater than 45 degrees in order to maintain optimal core engagement. I would recommend that each player find their own intuitive sense of this angle and follow that. So this constitutes the lower end of the angle spectrum, which tends to affect longer span players more than shorter span players for obvious reasons. For example, shorter span players are naturally more extended to reach the same spot on the board than longer span players. But what about the higher end of the angle spectrum? At first glance, it's tempting to say that more extension is always good because of the core connection. But in order to put the fingers in a healthy position to play beside each other with a reasonably straight and unflexed wrist, there's a limit to the amount of extension in the left arm that will still allow the left wrist to square with the neck in a healthy way. Again, each person should find their own sweet spot based on their own body type and strive to stay within that to support the core connection. Once we have each found our sweet spot for elbow angle, the tilt axis comes into play as the core mechanism that can keep the elbow angle in the healthy range no matter what range of the bass we happen to be playing in. Let's use a 2-octave B-flat scale as an example, and let's start by finding the most comfortable arm position for both the bottom note and the top note without actually yet playing the scale in between. And as a side note, in these examples, when possible, I'll exert a video of how a standing player might experience these same exercises. I'll offer these little inserts without comment after playing the same exercise from a seated position. So for that B flat, if I'm looking for the most comfortable elbow angle to play that B flat, it's probably about like this, close to 90 degrees. And then when I go play the top B flat, again, same thing. So low position, high position. Now let's take a cue from Michael Klinghoffer's excellent How to Drive a Double Bass video series. If you haven't seen that, I highly recommend that you check it out. And let's examine how not to use the core to support a healthy elbow angle. For this, we could start at either endpoint, but let's start at the top. Find the healthy elbow angle that enables you to most comfortably play that high B flat at the end of the scale, and then, without moving your core at all, reach back with only your arm and play the bottom B flat. So first, we find the healthy position to play this high B flat. It's about here. I've got a good elbow angle. Now, without moving my core at all, I'm going to reach back and play that low B flat. Well, the moment we do this, the problem becomes immediately clear. And yes, I'm holding this position on purpose. If we don't move our core, our elbow closes almost completely, thus cutting it off from the core and introducing tension in the shoulder and the forearm. We can still stop the string, but with much more difficulty and only by introducing a lot of unneeded tension into the mechanism. Now that we have experienced this unhealthy angle and tension, let's keep the finger where it is and tilt the core back to the point that makes the whole mechanism feel relaxed again. For me, that is about here. Much better. Next, let's try the same experiment from the opposite direction, keeping your core where it is to comfortably play the low B flat. Reach up with only your arm and reach the high B flat and examine the resulting posture of the body. Notice that now the finger can still play the note, but the arm is extended too far to easily square the hand to the fingerboard, which would make it difficult for the other fingers to play anything in relation to that high note, to the high B flat. Now let's tilt the core into the position that gives us a healthy elbow angle and feel the difference. So we went from here to here. Next, let's compare these two positions back to back. So we started here, and we ended here. Here, and here. So the difference was between this and this. Doing this shows us that the tilt axis is an extremely important component of keeping the arm in a healthy and comfortable shape. And logically, this core tilt motion happens gradually rather than all at once. Let's use two not this but this sort of examples by way of illustration. The first is a 1-octave vomit exercise. So not this, and certainly not this. But rather this. Next, let's add in the missing notes between the extremes of the 2-octave B-flat scale. What we're looking for is not this, and certainly not this. So here we are at the high B flat. But rather this. This last example allows us to keep the healthy elbow angle much more consistent from the bottom of the range to the top, using the tilt of the core to help support it and moving the active body mechanism closer to the center. Once we've felt the importance of this core axis and how it relates to different ranges of playing on the bass, it can become an important troubleshooting tool to help us self-diagnose technical issues for those times when we may be running into physical stress and or tension, but are too caught up in the trees to see the forest we're standing in. Most players subconsciously use some version of this axis when playing ascending and descending passages. But I would encourage all players, regardless of the technique method that you follow, to be aware of this big picture aspect of your technique, especially when practicing and troubleshooting for problems and or tension. I see this issue most commonly with students when playing descending passages where they often fail to tilt their torso back far enough on the descent, leaving them with a tight elbow angle and forearm and shoulder tension that go with that. At this point in lessons, a meaningful glance at their elbow is usually all it takes to correct it. Next, let's move on to the rotation axis. First, let's look at how the rotation axis comes into play during left-hand string crossings. If we accept the premise that keeping a relatively neutral and relaxed wrist position is a basic aspect of healthy technique, then it follows that the rest of the arm would need to adjust to keep the wrist in a healthy position when crossing the strings in either direction. The easiest way I know of to demonstrate this is to examine what happens when we play descending string crossings without rotating the core. Start by finding the most comfortable elbow and wrist position to play an A flat on the G string. Next, without moving your core at all, play the E flat, B flat, and F on the next three lower strings, and then stop. So here we're in a nice straight position. We're going to play the next three strings down. Look at the angle of the wrist, then hold that shape and remove the hand from the bass. Notice that without moving the core, or the bass for standing players, the wrist angle on the E string is flexed beyond the healthy point. Too much flexion. Now try the exercise again, only this time take a mental snapshot of the wrist angle on each string when the core doesn't move. For most people, the G string will be totally fine because that's where we calibrated the wrist position. The D string will be within the relaxed wrist range, here, and the overflexion will begin on the A string and will be worst on the E string. Try the exercise again one more time in the same way and hold the low F for about 10 seconds, paying attention to the feeling in the left hand and forearm as the small muscles strain to hold the note down without the core support. This is the shape and feeling we're trying to avoid. And the longer I hold this with this bent wrist position, the more this underside of the forearm starts to burn. Next, let's do the same exercise, only this time let's rotate the core to the left and whatever amount is needed to maintain a healthy wrist angle as we descend. Approaching the exercise in this way, it's possible to maintain a completely straight wrist if we want, or we can fudge a bit and just shoot for a healthy wrist angle within the relaxed range. Either way, it's a much healthier and sustainable outcome. So notice that now we've got a nice straight wrist angle because we've rotated the core. So not this, but this. Following up on the second point we made at the beginning of this segment, let's move on to examining how the hands interact along the rotation axis. This concept is very intuitive and feels natural because the hands will always move in tandem, so a simple rotation of the core will work to keep both hands at healthy angles in the healthy range. In the most basic sense, the core rotates to the player's right when moving from a lower string to a higher string, and to the left, to the player's left, when moving from a higher string to a lower string. We covered the left hand aspect of this in the previous segment, so let's focus on the right hand here before combining the two hands again. With our left arm hanging relaxed by our side or resting on the bass to stabilize it for standing players, let's start by finding the most comfortable core and arm angle to pluck or bow the open G string. It helps to try this in front of a mirror if possible to help visualize what's happening. For me, that angle is about here. So I'm rotated to the right to get my elbow and shoulder in the right place. to play that G string. Next, without allowing your core to rotate and using only your right arm, pluck or bow the lower strings in order. Notice that your right arm and shoulder will likely have to go through some unusual contortions in order to keep the core from moving. In my case, I also end up with an unhealthy lateral wrist flexion in the plucking hand by the time I get to the E string. So I'm not going to move the core. I'm going to leave my left hand here. And you can see here, without moving the core, by the time I got to the E string, my right wrist is in this position, which is not good. Now do the same exercise again, but allow your core to slightly rotate from left to right as your hand descends from higher to lower strings and vice versa. Spend a few minutes just going from high to low and back again, focusing on the rotation of the core. As a side note, I feel it in the hips and even the lower back, even when playing seated. And notice what it looks and feels like performing this exercise in front of a mirror. Notice the core moving. In order to support the arm and keep it in a healthy position. Next, we'll try the same exercise, only this time don't actually pluck or bow the string. Instead, just touch the string lightly as you practice this rotation and get a good feeling for the movement and get an image in your mind of what it looks like in the mirror. So without actually playing, we're going to do the same thing. And we're focusing on what's happening here in the core, especially down here in the lower part of the core. Next, let's put the two hands together again and see how logical their interaction is on this axis. First, slowly repeat the A flat, E flat, B flat, F exercise we did earlier with both hands, only this time focus on the rotation axis that helps you keep a healthy elbow and wrist angle. Notice how the hands moving in tandem in the same direction makes this a very natural movement. Last, let's play a 1-octave G major scale slowly up and down and focus on the rotation axis while we're doing it. The rotation is slightly interrupted by playing multiple notes on the middle strings, but with a little practice, we can still feel the flow of the overall rotation. At this point, I'd like to point out a common mistake I see with beginning and some intermediate players. Most players become aware of the stress and pain associated with too much wrist flexion, and it's natural for the body to try to find a way to alleviate the pain. One coping method that I often see less experienced players use to help straighten the wrist on the lower strings is to raise the left shoulder very high on descending string crossings and to tilt in very close to the base. Visually, this looks something like this. So you start in a good position, and then you just raise the elbow and come in, raise the shoulder and come in to keep the wrist straight rather than rotating. You can end up doing something like that. I've come to think of this as the high shoulder trap. It means well because it exists to alleviate an unhealthy wrist angle, and it does do this. But in a kind of chain reaction, it also creates an unhealthy shoulder and elbow angle that, in addition to cutting off the hand from the core, is not advisable in the long term for those in search of relaxed, injury-free playing in the long term. Let's compare them side by side. Not this, but rather this. Notice the difference of the shoulder. On the first one, when you tilt in and raise the shoulder's way up here and the elbow angle is cut off, as opposed to that. Not this. But rather this. Of course, which approach to take is up to each player, but in my experience, the second option is far healthier, more relaxed, and more core-centric. Our third and final point in this rotation axis segment had to do with the unequal nature of the fingers and the way the rotation axis affects them. In the lower positions, especially on the lower strings, the rotation axis can be used in a very subtle way to help support the fourth finger whenever it plays, which facilitates a more relaxed technique, no matter whether the player is using a traditional frame shape or a relaxed left hand. The reason for this comes down to simple anatomy. The fourth finger is much shorter than the others, and it resides on the outside of the hand. Because of this, it's natural reaction of the body to drop the elbow a bit to help move the fourth finger into place when using it to stop the string. But this motion actually comes from the shoulder, and the shoulder is connected to the, you guessed it, the core. So rather than use 1,000 words where a simple demonstration will do, let's examine 3 ways to move from a low F played with 1 and a low G played with 4, and pay special attention to the strength of the stop and the relaxation of the hand. We'll do this exercise in 3 steps. First, find the most comfortable and healthy position to play the low F with a healthy shoulder, elbow, and wrist angle. Now, without moving the arm or dropping the elbow, play the low G with 4 and hold it. Then move back and forth between the two. So we find the healthy angles to play the low F. We've got a nice straight wrist. We've got a decent elbow angle. Now, without moving the core, I'm going to play the G and hold it. Now I'm going to move back and forth. In order for me to do this, I have to forego the relaxed left hand entirely and use the traditional frame, and also brace the fourth finger by pressing down all of the other fingers behind it. Even when I do this, holding the G introduces tension into the hand and arm. Second, let's do the same exercise, only this time we'll allow the left elbow to drop, from the shoulder of course, when moving from the F to the G. Hold the G, then move back and forth as before. Having added this mechanic, I can now choose to use the frame or the relaxed hand because of the core support from the shoulder. So, frame, relaxed hand. In addition, holding the G for any extended period feels a lot more relaxed. Third and last, let's do the same exercise again, this time keeping the dropped elbow and adding in a small amount of core rotation into the motion. Having added this mechanic, I feel even more relaxed and connected than before, and the stop on the G feels even more connected and effortless. Finally, let's do one last example where we consciously combine the tilt axis with the rotation axis. For this, let's use a 2-octave F major scale and let's try to really focus on the ways that the two axes interact. To sum up the basics, first, the purpose of both axes is to keep the whole chain, hand, wrist, elbow, and shoulder, in a healthy position throughout. Second, we use the tilt axis to do this by using a slight tilt backward in the lower positions and a slight tilt forward as we climb the G string, then do the reverse on the way down. So, back, forward, back, forward. Next, we'll use the rotation axis to support the chain by rotating slightly to the left on the lower strings and rotating slightly toward the right on the higher strings. Additionally, we can use a very slight rotation to the right to better support the fourth finger if we choose. So going really slowly and really focusing on the core support, let's play the exercise and see how all of these elements look and feel when used in combination. Last, for good measure, let's speed up the exercise and see if we can keep the same core motions involved. Well, if you've made it this far through all the weeds of technical detail in this presentation, you are to be congratulated. You are a true bass nerd. There's a lot to think about within the simple concepts of tilt and rotation, and there are still many more details we haven't covered here. It's taken me years to get to the point where I'm really starting to feel like my technique is truly being driven from the core, much in the way I described in relation to Doris Kai's in the first video. But I'd like to encourage everyone to consider these two aspects of your bass technique with focus and attention, especially when you practice. Your music and your body will thank you in the long run, especially as your body ages. Stay tuned for what I intend to be the next and last video in the Bass Jitsu series, an installment entitled Calibration, which focuses on daily exercises in 12 keys that anyone can design and use to keep your body tuned into your bass technique. As always, thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see you here in the future.